Have you ever been in a situation where someone judged you without knowing the truth? What if that judgment came from a person in power? That's exactly what happened to David Carter on what should have been a regular afternoon. It was a hot summer day, and David, a 34-year-old businessman, had just stopped at a gas station to fill up his brand-new luxury car. He was wearing a tailored navy blue suit, looking every bit the part of a successful entrepreneur. He was on his way to a major business meeting, a deal that could change his life forever. The afternoon felt full of potential. Everything was going according to plan. But that was about to change. As David swiped his credit card to pay for the fuel and grabbed the fuel pump, he noticed a police officer watching him from across the lot. The officer's eyes were fixed on him, scrutinizing his every move. At first, David thought nothing of it, until the officer started walking toward him with purpose. David wasn't doing anything wrong. He had just stopped to refuel as any other person would. But as the officer closed the distance between them, David began to feel uneasy. Something wasn't right. And then it happened. Officer Reynolds, a cop known for his aggressive policing and quick assumptions, walked straight toward David, his hand already hovering over his baton. Without saying a word, he grabbed David by the collar and shoved him against the gas pump. The suddenness of the move left David breathless. "What do you think you're doing here?" the officer growled, his voice low and threatening. "This isn't your car, is it?" David's heart dropped. The officer was accusing him without cause, without any reason. His new luxury car, which he had worked so hard to afford, was now the focal point of a harsh and baseless accusation. He didn't know how to respond. Was he being profiled? Was this an assumption based solely on the car he was driving? He tried to speak, to explain himself, but his thoughts were clouded by the sudden aggression of the officer. David opened his mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. The officer's grip on his collar was firm, and the situation escalated quickly. He had never been in a situation like this before, where his background, his appearance, and his success seemed to count for nothing. He was being treated like a criminal without cause. This wasn't how a law-abiding citizen should be treated. This wasn't how anyone should be treated. The officer's eyes were full of suspicion, and David could feel his pulse racing. It felt like everything was slipping out of his control. This wasn't just a routine stop. It was an unjust targeting. And as the officer stood there, glaring at him, David knew that the next few minutes could change everything. This wasn't about what David had done or hadn't done. It wasn't about his actions. It was about the officer's assumptions, based on nothing more than the car he drove. The situation had gone from a simple stop to a confrontation. David had done nothing wrong, yet he was being treated as though he were guilty of something. The reality of the situation started to sink in. David wasn't just a man trying to fill up his car. He was being judged, unfairly targeted, and stereotyped. And the worst part, he knew he was powerless to stop it. This wasn't just about one person's actions. It was about the broader system of assumptions and biases that were at play. A heavy silence hung between them, and David stood there, still too stunned to respond, his mind racing. How could something like this happen in broad daylight? What was he supposed to do now? As Officer Reynolds stood there, waiting for a response, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to escalate into something ugly. And deep down, he knew that the simple fact of being in the wrong place at the wrong time could have major consequences. Have you ever been unfairly targeted? Share your experience in the comments. The people at the gas station froze. Everyone was watching, but no one intervened. The tension in the air was palpable as Officer Reynolds continued to grip David's collar, yanking him away from the car with force. The other customers, standing by their vehicles, looked on in silence, but no one dared to speak up. "I don't have time for your lies," the officer snapped, his tone filled with contempt. "Hands on the car now." David's heart was pounding in his chest, but he tried to stay calm. He knew the officer's actions were unjust. He knew what was happening. He had seen cases like this before, too many times, where men who looked like him were unfairly profiled, harassed, and arrested, sometimes with nothing to show for it but bruises and broken trust. He tried to steady his breath, hoping that by keeping his cool, he wouldn't make the situation worse. But what made things worse? David's keys and wallet were still in the car. He had left them there, a habit he'd had for years. The officer, seeing the car with the keys still inside and no immediate proof that David owned it, quickly jumped to a conclusion. His mind was already made up. Without his ID, without the obvious sign of ownership, Officer Reynolds assumed that David had stolen the vehicle. David's stomach sank as the officer's suspicion turned into outright accusation. "You think you can just drive a car like this without anyone noticing?" the officer growled. "You're coming with me." Before David could respond, the sound of approaching sirens sliced through the air. More cop cars appeared on the horizon, their flashing lights cutting through the summer heat. In an instant, the gas station was surrounded. Officers poured out of their vehicles, some walking, some running, all of them converging around David. The whole scene shifted from a simple misunderstanding to something much worse. It felt like David had become the focus of a crime scene. The sirens blared loudly, and David could feel the weight of the situation crushing him. What had been a routine stop had now escalated into something completely out of his control. The officers surrounded him like he was a dangerous criminal, their hands on their holsters, ready to act. David's mind raced. What had started with a simple stop to fill up his car had turned into a terrifying nightmare. David took a deep breath. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, but he knew he had to act fast. If he didn't, the situation could spiral out of control quickly. The last thing he wanted was for his actions to be misinterpreted, for things to escalate into something violent. He had to find a way to make them understand, make them see that he was the victim here, not the perpetrator. "Officer, please," David said, his voice steady but firm. "I own this car. I'm just trying to get to a meeting. You've got the wrong person." But the officer didn't listen. His face was hard, unyielding. His assumption had already been made. He wasn't about to let go of his grip on David just because the man was telling the truth. David's thoughts raced. He needed to get to his ID. He needed to prove that he wasn't a thief, that this was his car. But his wallet and keys were still locked inside. He could feel the weight of the situation escalating around him. If the police didn't listen, if they kept pushing him into the role of a criminal, there was no telling how this would end. David knew he had to do something to diffuse the tension before the situation went too far. He couldn't let this moment slip away, not when his life and future were on the line. He had to act now, or everything could be lost. What would you do in a situation like David's? Have you ever felt unjustly accused? Share your thoughts in the comments. With his back pressed against the fuel pump and Officer Reynolds gripping his arm tightly, David finally found his voice. His chest was tight with a mix of frustration and fear, but he knew he had to stay calm if he was going to get through this. "Officer, this is my car. My name is David Carter. I have proof in my wallet inside the vehicle. Please, just let me get it," David said, his words coming out in a controlled rush. The officer, who had been glaring at him with increasing suspicion, let out a mocking laugh. The sound sent a chill down David's spine. It was as though the officer didn't even care to listen, his mind already set on what he believed the truth to be. "Oh, so you expect me to believe that a guy like you owns a car like this?" Officer Reynolds sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "That's funny, real funny." David's patience was wearing thin, but he knew that reacting in anger would only make things worse. He forced himself to stay composed, his eyes locked on the officer's, refusing to show weakness. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to resolve the situation. "Look," David said, keeping his voice as steady as possible, "I can call someone. Just check the registration. The car is in my name." But the officer wasn't listening. The words bounced off him as if David wasn't even speaking. Instead, the officer's eyes narrowed, and without another word he pulled out his handcuffs, the cold metal gleaming in the harsh light. He clicked them open, preparing to arrest David on the spot. David's heart raced. His pulse thundered in his ears. Was this really happening? Was this how his day was going to end? Just moments ago, he had been on his way to a crucial business meeting, a meeting that could change his career. Now, it seemed like he was on the verge of being arrested for something he didn't do, for a crime he hadn't committed. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut sent a wave of panic through him. Was this it? Would his life be completely derailed over a simple misunderstanding? He felt his throat tighten as he searched for a way out. But the officer's stance was firm, his hand already reaching for the radio at his side to call for backup. Then something happened. Something that changed everything. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, her phone held high in her hand, recording everything that had been unfolding. The camera clicked and whirred as she captured the scene, her gaze fixed firmly on Officer Reynolds. "Hey, officer, I've been filming this whole thing," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the tense silence. The officer's hand froze midair, his fingers hovering over the radio. The shock of being caught off guard was clear in his expression. As he turned toward the woman, his stance stiffening. He hadn't expected anyone to challenge his authority, not so boldly, not so publicly. The crowd had been watching quietly, but now, with the phone recording his every move, the officer found himself in an impossible position. "You've been harassing this man for no reason," the woman continued, her voice unwavering. "I saw him pull up in that car, pay for his gas, and now you're treating him like a criminal." David's eyes widened. The woman's words echoed through his mind. He wasn't just a suspect in this officer's eyes. He was now a victim of a clear case of racial profiling. The officer had made up his mind, but this stranger's intervention was unraveling the narrative that had been constructed. David saw the officer's face turn pale as he processed the woman's words. His eyes flicked nervously toward the phone, and for the first time, the power he had so confidently wielded earlier seemed to slip away. The situation was turning, and the officer realized, too late, that he had been caught in the act. But the real twist was yet to come. As the officer stammered and looked from the woman to David, trying to regain his composure, David finally caught a glimpse of the woman's badge. It wasn't just any badge. It was the badge of a federal agent. She was an off-duty officer with authority that far surpassed the local police force, and she wasn't about to let this injustice slide. "I suggest you let him go before this becomes a lawsuit," the woman said, her tone now calm but firm, as she stepped in front of David, positioning herself between him and the officer. The officer stood motionless, his eyes shifting between the woman and David. But he didn't make a move. It was clear he was unsure of how to handle the situation now that it had escalated so quickly. He was caught, and there was nowhere left to hide. The entire gas station watched in stunned silence. The tension that had been thick in the air now felt like a heavy weight pressing down on everyone. The crowd had gone from being passive onlookers to active witnesses, their eyes locked on the unfolding drama. The officer, who had held all the power just moments before, was now the one under scrutiny, his actions being recorded and questioned. David stood there, still processing what was happening. His heart was pounding in his chest, but the feeling of relief was starting to wash over him. The woman had stepped in when no one else would, and her intervention had shifted the power in the room. The officer could no longer act with impunity, and David felt the weight of that realization lift from his shoulders. But even though the immediate threat had passed, the damage had already been done. The officer's actions had been exposed for what they were, a baseless and aggressive assumption that could have led to far more dangerous consequences. David had been treated like a criminal for no reason at all, simply because of the car he drove and the assumptions made based on his appearance. The woman's intervention had stopped the situation from escalating, but the impact of what had happened lingered. David wasn't just facing a wrongful accusation. He was living through a moment that was all too familiar for many, where bias and profiling led to unnecessary confrontation. As the officer backed away, David was left standing there, unsure of how to process everything that had just unfolded. The woman had saved him, but the reality of what had happened was hard to ignore. The truth had come to light, and now everyone at the gas station knew exactly what had occurred. What would you have done in David's situation? Have you ever felt unfairly accused? Share your thoughts in the comments. David's story is proof that injustice thrives in silence, but it can also be defeated with courage. When David was confronted by Officer Reynolds, wrongly accused and unfairly treated, he had a choice: to walk away, let the officer's actions slide and pretend it never happened, or to stand up, fight for what was right, and make sure his voice was heard. David chose to fight, and in doing so he set in motion a chain of events that not only changed his life, but helped spark a larger conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. "I wasn't going to let that officer define me," he said in an interview after the case had been resolved. "I knew I had to fight back, and now, because of this, fewer people will have to go through what I did." His words resonated deeply with anyone who had ever faced unfair treatment, reminding them that their voice, their truth, matters. David's decision to take action, to not let the situation slide or be swept under the rug, ultimately led to the officer being held accountable for his actions. It led to greater awareness about the pervasive issue of racial profiling, sparking nationwide conversations about police misconduct and leading to policies aimed at ensuring greater accountability within law enforcement. But David didn't stop there. His personal battle turned into a fight for others, and he used his experience to push for systemic change. By funding legal aid for victims of racial discrimination, David made sure that others who had been unjustly targeted would have the support and resources they needed to stand up and fight for justice. His story serves as a powerful lesson in standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. Too often, people who are victims of injustice feel powerless, believing that speaking out will only bring more harm. David showed us that silence allows injustice to flourish. By using his voice, his resources, and his platform, he fought back not only for himself, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly targeted, stereotyped, or dismissed. His story demonstrated that one person's courage can challenge the status quo and create a ripple effect of change. David's resolve also sends a clear message to anyone who feels overlooked, undervalued, or unfairly accused. Never let someone's prejudice define your worth. You have the right to stand tall, to defend yourself, and to demand the respect you deserve. Fighting for your rights isn't just a matter of personal dignity. It's a way of ensuring that others, too, have the courage to do the same. In a world where so many are still marginalized and discriminated against, David's story reminds us all that we have the power to speak up, to make a difference, and to hold those in power accountable for their actions. David proved that sometimes you have to push back against a broken system in order to fix it. He didn't back down when it mattered most, and now his actions are helping to pave the way for a future where more people can feel safe, heard, and respected. What would you have done in David's place? Let us know in the comments.